So in today's video, I'm going to show you a quick method for painting watercolor cherry blossom trees in Procreate. This technique is very spontaneous and no planning or sketching is necessary. However, you will need some kind of splatter or grunge brushes to paint them this way. I do sell the brushes I used in this video on my Etsy store. However, the technique here is pretty flexible and it will work with any splatter brushes you're comfortable with. And to start, I'm going to rough out the canopy first. So for that, I need some kind of splatter brush. Personally, I prefer something that's kind of clumpy like this. Some splatter brushes are more like a mist or a spray. I find that these don't work very well for trees. So I think in this case, I'm going to stick with number 17. And for the color, I need to choose some kind of pink tone. And it can be a little bit tricky to find exactly the right kind of Sakura color, but I have a trick I want to show you. So first, set your color panel here to classic. Then you can choose the hue here and just bring it all the way to the right. And then right here are all the Sakura colors you need. So I'm going to start with a kind of pink tone like this. And then using this splatter brush, I'm just going to dab it around and stack a couple of splatters on top of each other. And I'll do a few clumps like this, just very roughly in the shape of my tree. But I am going to make sure I leave some gaps in between these. And this looks pretty good. It's not too dense. Sakura trees in general are pretty airy and empty, and they have a lot of voids in the canopy. So that's why I went out of my way to leave some of these blank spaces. And this part so far is basically like the background wash for the canopy. So the next thing I'm going to add is the mid-tone wash. And that's going to be on a separate layer just above this background. I'm going to use the same splatter brush, but I'm going to lighten my Sakura color a little bit like this. Same size, and I'm just going to tap it around, pretty much covering the same areas that I did with the background wash. And once the background wash and the mid-tone wash are finished, we can move on and start painting the trunk. And that's going to be on a separate layer, but it needs to be below the mid-tone wash and above the background. For the color, I'm going to choose a sort of golden brown tone like this. And for the brush, I'm going to use one in the inking category here called tinderbox. So you can plan out your trunk however you want, but I like trunks that have a kind of split to them. So here's how I'm going to do that. I'm just going to draw this kind of initial branch going from the top of the tree down. I'll fill out the bottom and widen it. Then I'll split off another branch and kind of send this out to another section of the tree. There we go. Then I'm going to kind of chase up some of these branches and make sure that they generally start wide and then get skinnier as they go away from the center. And then once I have this basic structure, I'm just going to go all over it, adding all kinds of random branches, making sure none of them are too straight. I definitely saw a lot of variation in the kind of texture of the branches when I was looking at Sakura photos, but personally, I preferred the ones that had pretty rough, kind of squiggly branches. And there we go, that looks really good. Now all these branches are done in exactly the same color, and that makes them look kind of flat and two-dimensional. So the next thing I like to do is add some shading. So I'm going to use the same tinderbox brush. I'm just going to choose a darker version of my branch color, and I'm going to paint this on just wherever I think there might be a shadow. And it's easier to see where to paint this kind of at the base of the trunk, but up here in the branches, I'm pretty much just doing it randomly. Now, if you look at the layers panel, you can see the branches here are below the midtones and above the background. And this means that some of the branches are being covered up by the midtones. And you can see that especially in areas like this. Now, this is an effect I like and I want to enhance it. So to do that, I'm going to first select the branch layer. Then I'm going to grab the eraser brush. And I'm actually going to totally erase some areas of the branches where I want them to totally disappear. And I think it's important to do this in denser areas of foliage like this. It doesn't make sense to erase a branch in a void. So I'm going to avoid those areas and just focus on these denser areas. And generally here, this turned out pretty good, but there's a couple areas I made a mistake. So in this area, for example, the branch is cut off right in a void, and I don't think that quite makes sense. So I'm just going to grab my brush again, still set to the same brush we did all the branches with. I'll just shrink the size, And I'll try to restructure some of these areas where I think I erased too much. Now at this point, it's really starting to look like a tree. But if you look on the edges here, you can see there's a bunch of flowers and leaves and stuff that are like disconnected and just kind of floating in space. And you could leave those there if you like how they look, but I think it's a good idea to remove them, and I'm going to show you a really easy way to do that. First though, we need to merge everything so far onto one layer. After that, I'm going to grab the selection tool and set it to automatic. And I'm going to tap and kind of slide on the trunk, and this will let me adjust the threshold. So I'm going to slide it a little bit, lift off my brush, tap and slide again, and I'm going to keep tapping and sliding until the whole screen sort of flashes blue. There we go. So when you reach this point where it starts flashing like that, just lift off the brush, tap on invert. That just flips around our selection and selects everything else. Then I'll tap on my tree layer and click clear. And you can see it basically deleted all the stuff that wasn't connected to the tree. And that's because the selection that we made was continuous and kind of grew throughout the tree. And of course, if that method is too confusing and you're not comfortable using the selection tool that way, you can always just grab the eraser brush, zoom in, and then manually erase any of the areas that are disconnected. Now at this point, the sort of basic form of the tree is finished, and you could stop if this is what you want to achieve. But next, I'm going to move on and show you maybe 5 details you can add that will really improve your tree. And the first detail I want to show you how to paint is the individual flower details. So for that, I'm going to change my brush to another default brush. It's called Mercury. For the color, I'm going to go back to my original Sakura color. And I'm just going to kind of dot this around and create these sort of hanging bunches of flowers. And this is kind of a subtle detail, but it does add a lot, and it's super easy to add. Next, I'm going to show you how to add a similar texture up here in the canopy, but for that, I need to make a separate layer above my tree. I'm going to choose a darker version of my Sakura color, and I'm going to use this same Mercury brush, and I'm just going to use this to tap randomly in the canopy and create these clusters of flowers. And once I'm happy with how these flower details look, I'm going to merge the layer for those together with the tree layer. The next detail I want to show you how to do is called selection blending, and it's hard to explain, but I think once you see it, you'll understand. So for that, I'm going to go to my selection tool and set it to freehand. And I'm just going to make a random selection that sort of tunnels throughout the tree like this. After I'm finished, I'll circle back and reconnect it to the beginning. Then I'll feather off this selection around 20%. Then I can go to my adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I can apply a Gaussian blur just to the area we selected. And you can see it adds a sort of soft, glowy effect throughout the tree, but I don't want it to be too strong, so I think I'll set it around 25%. And of course, depending on your art style, you might not like the soft look that you get from selection blending, but for me, I think it's worth it because it gives the trees a sort of light, airy, dreamy vibe. Now the next detail I want to show you is how to add a sort of golden hour sunbeam highlight effect. And this is a look I saw in a lot of my reference images, and it's really easy to add. So what I usually do is I'll start at the trunk, I'll grab the selection tool, still set to freehand, and I'll just select kind of a shape like this, just a box going across, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten it. And I think that looks pretty good, like light is kind of filtering in. And I'm going to go there and do this in a few other areas on the trunk. And once I'm done with the trunk, I'm going to do a similar trick on the canopy. So again, I'll grab the selection tool set to freehand, but this time I'm going to create some very rough, random, kind of bushy selections like this. I'll reconnect it, then I'll go to my adjustments and brighten it just like before. And this is how I create subtle highlights in the canopy. And finally, the last thing I like to do to finish up my trees is kind of rebalance the whole thing. So for that, I'm going to make sure everything related to the tree is merged together onto one layer. Then I'll grab the arrow tool. I'm going to set it to warp. And I'm going to move this around and try to give the tree a slightly interesting posture. And I'm going to make sure it looks balanced as well. And just like that, this Sakura tree is finished. If this technique seems familiar to you, it's because it's nearly the same one I used for the autumn tree tutorial I made a while ago. For some reason, painting trees this way, sort of like from back to front, is so far the most reliable method I've found. And that pretty much wraps it up. If you think I've earned it, please give this video a like. And here are 2 more similar tutorials I think you'll love to watch next.